What's up guys, today we're going to talk about Node.js modules, which is based on CommonJS approach, and we will also talk about the require function, which gives us the ability to use other modules in our application. So here we have a module1.js file where we have a simple console.log statement. Now in Node.js every file is a module, so we can import this as a module in another file by making a require call. So here we have app1.js where we are requiring that module by using the require function. Now this require comes from CommonJS specs. So if you go to the CommonJS specs, you will see there is a require function which allows you to import other modules in your application. So we will not talk about the CommonJS specs, but we will talk about the Node.js implementation of the CommonJS modules. So when you import or require a module, what happens is this code in that file will execute, and this code will be executed inside a wrapper. So if you see inside the Node.js documentation, whatever you wrote in that file will execute inside this wrapper as an IFI. So here we have access to these 5 variables: exports, require, module, file name, and dir name. So what we are interested in is this module variable and this exports variable, because this allows us to export things from that file to the file that actually makes the require call. So by default, if you don't assign anything to module.exports, it's have a empty value, empty object. So what get exported from this module is an empty object. So currently we are not doing any assignment to module.exports. So it will have an empty object, and that will get exported from this file. So if we print here m1 console.log m1, you will see the thing that gets exported from this require call is an empty object. So let's just execute this file. So node app1.js. So we get this line printed, module m1, which is there in this file, and this empty object gets printed because of this line, because we are exporting by default an empty object. So we said like whatever module.exports point to, that thing gets exported from this file. So let's just see what the value of that module variable is. So if I do a console.log and print module, and let's also print the exports variable. So we have these 2 variables, exports and module. So let's just print their value inside that module. So let's copy this and paste it, and let's just change it to exports, and let's now execute this file. So this module is actually referring to an object which have a lot of properties, and the property that we are interested in is this exports property, which refers to an empty object. And we have seen that because by default that module.exports will have an empty object, and what get exported from that file depends on what you assign to module.exports, and by default it have an empty object. But that interesting thing is that exports variable also points to an empty object. So let's do an equality test whether these both module.exports and exports points to the same empty object or not. So let's do console.log module.exports triple equal exports, because they both have the empty object as the default value, and here we are checking whether these both are pointing to the same empty object or not. So let's just run this. So it prints true. That means they both refer to the same empty object, and that empty object get exported from this file. So rather than exporting a empty object, we can assign properties to this empty object. So we can do that using module.exports say a property sum, which will point to a function that can take 2 arguments, and it will return a plus b. So now in m1 what we are exporting, what we are exporting here is an object which have a sum property which refers to an function. So let's just print this, and you will see that m1 is an object which have a sum property which refers to a function. So let's just clear out, and so here we have a object that get exported from that module 1. So it have property sum, and which refers to a function. So we can call this as m1 dot sum and pass two numbers, say 12 and 13. So it should give us 25, and we get 25. And since both module.exports and exports point to the same object, and here we have just added one property to that object sum, we can also do that with just exports.sum, because both module.exports and exports point to the same object. We have seen that, and we have seen that this with this test, equality test, because both of these equal to the same empty object. So both these point to the same empty object, and so we can do that with just exports.sum rather than doing module.exports.sum. So this will work the same way. So if I execute, we will get the same result. So let's assign another property, but this time we will use module.export.multiply, and let's it point to a function again, and it will take two numbers and it will return the multiplication of these two numbers. That's it. So return a into b, and here we can call m1 dot multiply. So let's just copy paste. So let's just make it 10, so it should print 120. And let's just save this file also and execute now. Let's clear out first and execute. So it's just, we call the sum again, I think, yeah. So let's just make it multiply, and it should print 120. So we get 120. So this is how we can attach properties to that empty object by doing exports.sum or module.exports dot that property name. And we can rather than just having function, these properties can have object or an array or a simple primitive value. So we can also do like exports dot alpha, which will be 100. So here we can just print out m1 dot alpha. So let's just console.log. So it should print 100. So we get 100. So we can export anything by attaching properties to that empty object. Now things are a bit different when we assign value to this module.exports or exports directly rather than attaching properties to these objects. So what if we try to, so let's just delete that. So what if I try to assign a value, say in this case a primitive value of 100 to module.exports? So will exports will also have the value 100? And if we do a equality test, what should be the result of that? So you will see that this will result in false, because in this case exports points to a different thing, and this module.exports points to 100. So let's just print these things also. So let's just print module.exports, and let's print out exports here. And this should result in false, because we are now assigning a primitive value of 100 to module.exports, and by default it have an empty object, and this exports will have a different value. So let's just see that. And now we cannot call these functions, so let's just uncomment, let's just comment these lines, and let's just print just m1 so we can see what we are exporting from that file. So now let's just run that. So clear. So it prints module m1, then 100 and empty object. So module.exports is 100 because we assign module.exports to 100, and this exports points to an empty object, and that equality between these two results in false. And what we are exporting is just simply module.exports, because all the time what get exported from that file is module.exports, not what exports points to. So now we can see when we assign values to module.exports and exports directly, the relationship between module.exports and exports breaks, and they don't point to the same thing. So rather than doing module.exports, we could have done this just with exports. Now in this case, exports will have the value 100. So let's just clear out and execute this file now. Now this module.exports points to empty object, and exports have value 100, and the equality between these two results in false, and what we are exporting from that file is an empty object, because this is what module.exports points to. So you should never assign values directly to module.exports or exports, and if you do that, you just break that chain between module.exports and exports. So if you do that, what you will have to do to keep the chain is you have to do that exports is equal to module.exports. Now in this case, we are saying export is equal to module.exports. So here we have specified 100, it doesn't mean anything. So module.exports will have this value 100. So if I say module.exports, which is 100, now we are assigning that 100 to exports also, and this will result in true. So now if I execute this file, let's just clear out. So this module.export is 100 and export is also 100, because we assign because of this statement. So we have to write this when we assign things directly to module.exports or exports, because that chain is broken if we assign values directly, and then we have to set that chain ourselves, and this result in true because we did that assignment. So just remember that you should not assign values to module.exports directly, and if you do that, just make sure you are making that chain yourself by doing this assignment, otherwise things will break, and what you think, like what module.exports point to and what exports points to, will be two different things. So let's just demo this thing one more time. So here I will assign it to a object, and it will have a property sum that will be a function again, and it will be a and b, and it will just return a plus b. So here we are assigning to module.exports an object. Now this will break the chain. So exports and module.exports now point to two different things. So module.exports is this an object, and exports will point to an empty object. So when we do the equality, this will result in false, and what gets exported from this file is this object which have the sum function. So let's just comment this for a second, and in the app1.js we can just log down m1. So let's just execute this now. So clear. So module m1, and this result was false, so this equality was false because this exports point to an empty object, and this module.exports point to another object because of this assignment, and we have broken the chain. So if you want to keep the chain, we have to do that exports is equal to module.exports. Now in this case, exports will also point to this object, and this will result in true. So if we execute now, we will get true, and this function get exported, and we can use that function in this file. So to sum up, never assign properties or values to this module.exports or exports directly, and if you do that, make sure you keep the chain by doing this assignment, otherwise you can it will lead to some different things than what you expect. So we can demo this again. So if I do exports dot say multiply, so I'm attaching to exports, which points to an empty object, a function, a property which points to a function. So A and B, and here I'm just gonna return A and A multiplication B. Now this test, equality test, will result in false because this module.exports points to this function, and we are and this exports actually points to an empty object, and we are attaching multiply to that empty object. So, and what will get exported from this file is this object. So we have broken the chain, and so you might think that we are attaching this multiply property to the same object, but this is not the case because we have done a direct assignment to this module.exports, and here we can just lock down M1. Let's see. So again, we just have a sum function, we don't have a multiply function here because we attach this multiply property to that other object, not the object that module.exports points to, and that equality test was false. That's why when you do an assignment to module.exports or exports directly, you break the chain. If you want to keep the chain, what you can do is this assignment to make sure that exports and module.exports points to the same thing. So if we do that here, now this multiply, because of this assignment, this exports will also point to the same object, which is this one, and we are attaching the property to this object, and we will be able to call that multiply, and this will result in true. So let's just run that. So this is true, and now we get this multiply. So just remember one thing, that directly don't assign values to module.exports or exports, and if you do that, just make sure you are keeping the chain by doing that assignment exports is equal to module.exports. And here we can use those functions m1.sum and m1.multiply. So let's just do that. So let's just uncomment these lines so that we can use that. So let's uncomment. So here we are using, now we don't have this alpha, so we can just comment that, and it will just give us 25 and 120. So let's just go that. So we get 25 and 120. So this is what we had to cover about module.exports and the difference between exports and when that chain is broken, and how you can set up the chain. And rather than doing that direct assignment, you should always do attach properties to those empty object by doing module.exports.property or exports.property. And one more thing about require that we want to just finish it up. So let's just comment these lines for a sec. So currently we are requiring this module 1 by specifying the relative path here dot. So this we are saying look for a file module1.js in the current directory. So it will look in the current directory, and there is a module1.js. So this path is related to the file that is calling the require. Now in this case we are calling require from app1.js, and this module1.js is in the same directory, so it will resolve and it will execute the code inside that. And we could have got rid of this, it will work. So we could have just removed the .js extension because it automatically looks for that, and it will still work. So if let's just uncomment again to just prove that it still works. So let's just clear out and run this. It just still works. And we could also specify absolute paths. So here we are doing the relative path, and we could have done the absolute path, which is this. So if I just copy this and put it here, it will work. So here we are just specifying the complete path to that module, and it will still work. But most of the time you will see people using relative path because that's easy, rather than specifying the complete path of the file. And you can again remove that JS extension. But you cannot do this thing, module 1, because this only works for Node.js core modules or the modules that you have installed using npm install. So if you try to do this, you will get an error because it won't be able to find module 1. cannot find module 1, because this is only possible for Node.js core modules. When you are trying to require Node.js core modules or modules that you have installed using npm by doing npm install, in that case you will get the module inside node module folders. So this is what about require and exports and module.exports. In the next one we will talk about Node.js module caching.